Shalom. Today we're going to be talking about a document known as the Recognitions of Clement. It's also gone by the name of the Nazarene Acts of the Apostles, or the Teachings of Peter. I've also seen it referred to as the Travels of Peter. So I'm going to start off by asking a question. Have you ever wondered this question? What about the 12 apostles? What happened to them? Why don't we know anything about them, really? We have apostle lists in the New Testament and the Gospels that tell us how Yeshua personally handpicked his apostles. He went throughout the countryside of Judea and Galilee, and he found these particular men that he picked out to be his apostles, his sent ones. And they were to go out and teach his doctrine and his gospel to the nations. But we don't know a whole lot about them. We know a lot about Paul. We got a bunch of letters from Paul, very long letters. But the only thing we have from the actual 12 is we got some very short epistles from John. We got one epistle from James. We've got two from Peter, although 2 Peter is widely regarded not to have been written by Peter. And that belief goes back as far as the 200s AD. So it's not a new doctrine or anything that, atheist scholars have come up with. It's something that the church was saying 1800 years ago, that 2 Peter was not genuine. We have the book of Revelation, which is written by John, but for the most part, we don't have a whole lot. We don't know much about them. We don't really know where they went, aside from some Catholic histories that may or may not be true. But when it comes to really understanding their doctrine and what was the message that Yeshua gave them to preach, all we really have is Paul. So why don't we know much about them? Well, for one reason, the original followers of Yeshua were not Christian. They were, some people say, Jewish, although what exactly Jewish means today is much different than what Jewish may have meant 2,000 years ago. They were Hebraic, certainly. They kept the Torah, they kept the commandments of Elohim, and they had the testimony of Yeshua. But the church itself rejects the Torah. Now, they do keep the testimony of Yeshua. However, they teach that his testimony had to do with doing away with the law and freeing us from the burden of Yeshua's Father's commandments. But that wasn't the doctrine that was taught by the original followers of Yeshua. So what name did they go by? Well, most people in the Hebraic roots movement knows that they went by the title the Nazareans or the Nazarenes. But that's not the only cognomen that they answer to. They were known as followers of the way. They call themselves the sons of light. They saw themselves as the sons of righteousness. Incidentally, many of the same titles that the earliest followers of Yeshua went by is also the same titles that the group that wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls call themselves. And I believe there's a reason for that, because the scrolls themselves, the Dead Sea Scrolls, the sectarian works contained there, were most likely written by the original apostles and their immediate disciples. There's a teacher of righteousness that's mentioned in the Dead Sea Scrolls, and there's lots of theories as to who exactly he is, but there's only one person in history that they absolutely fit perfectly based upon all the information we know about this person. And that person is James, the brother of Yeshua. And it's highly likely that the teacher of righteousness was, in fact, the brother of the Master. So why don't we know more about these 12 apostles? What other names do they go by? Well, the one I want to focus on today is the Ebionites, or in English, it would be the poor. Ebionim being the Hebrew word for poor. The Ebionites, we don't know a whole lot about them. Most of the information that we have comes from heresiologists. They were men that wrote against the groups that believed in Yeshua who were not part of the church. So basically, for instance, we've got a lot of information about the Ebionites from a church historian known as Epiphanius in his work, the Panarion. Now, keep in mind, Epiphanius was essentially he was a company man. He was a Catholic, or at least he was a member of the church that eventually evolved into the Catholic Church. The purpose of his writing was not necessarily to teach truth so much as it was to protect the orthodoxy. And so in his writings, anything that does not fit with the official church line or the official church doctrine, in his mind, is a heresy. So I'm going to read through some of his quotes. He has an extensive chapter on the Ebionites in his book, but I'm just going to go over a few key pieces of information. Mostly because if we go through too much of this information, it's hard to really understand what he's writing about, because in his writings he is trying so hard to demonize this group. But he makes several key admissions. Now you'll notice here, this is the beginning of chapter 30 of the Panarion. Chapter 29 was about the Nazareans. So he's flowing right into the Ebionites. And he says at the beginning of the chapter, following these, which is the Nazareans, and holding views like theirs, Ebion, the founder of the Ebionites, arose in the world in his turn as a monstrosity with many forms, and practically represented on himself the snake-like form of the mythical many-headed Hydra. He was of the Nazarene school, but preached and taught other things than they. So right away you see the tone of his letter, or his book is completely against the Ebionites. I mean, he calls this person, their founder, Ebion, a snake like a many-headed Hydra. Now, in reality, there was no Ebion. The Ebionites are not named after a man named Ebion. But for whatever reason, Epiphanius is asserting that they are. And he's attacking this person, Ebion. However, as we go on, you'll see that he admits who the Ebionites say founded them, and is very revealing. So we'll jump down a couple of paragraphs, and he says, this sect now forbids celibacy and continence altogether, as do the other sects which are like it. For at one time they prided themselves on virginity, presumably because of James, the Lord's brother, and so addressed their treatises to elders and virgins. Okay, so what does this mean? Well, every time that you read a historical reference to James, whether it's Hegesippus or Epiphanius or Eusebius, Hippolytus, there's this association with James and the poor. Now, using translations that they pick and choose how they're going to translate this word, the poor, because they want to disassociate James with the Ebionites. So when they say that in their writings, they of course translate the word Ebionim into Greek, so it shows up as the poor, not the Ebionim. Same thing with English. They translate it into English as the poor, rather than leaving it as the Ebionites, because they don't want to associate James with this group. However, here you can see this admission by Epiphanius that the Ebionites were very much associated with James. So James, according to several historical references we have, was a lifelong virgin. And originally the Ebionites practiced celibacy, but once they moved out of Jerusalem, they actually forbid celibacy, because they realized that if they did not have children, then their movement was eventually going to die out. So we'll go on to the next reference. he says that their origin, the Ebionites' origin, came after the fall of Jerusalem, for since practically all who had come to faith in Christ had settled in Perea, then in Pella, a town in the Decapolis, the Gospel mentions which is near Betania and Bashantis, as they have moved there and were living there. Now this is a very well-known event. Just prior to the destruction of Jerusalem, in or around 66 Common Era, the early church, we'll call them church, the early assembly in Jerusalem were warned by a prophet to flee the city. And so at their first opportunity, they left the city of Jerusalem because they knew it was about to be destroyed. And they went to Pella. So if you were to go to Google and type in the flight to Pella, you'll get all kind of information about this. This is a well-known historical event, that the original followers of Yeshua fled to Pella before the destruction of Jerusalem. Now, notice that he's admitting that the Ebionites originated out of Pella, which was the same area where the original apostles went to. Moving on, he says, they too accept the gospel according to Matthew, like the Cerinthians and Merinthians. They too use it alone. They call it according to the Hebrews, and it is true to say that Matthew expounded and preached the gospel in the Hebrew language and alphabet in the New Testament. So, okay, this is a bit of a legendary book, the gospel according to the Hebrews. We've got several references to it. Jerome quotes out of it. Supposedly he even translated it into Latin. It's also mentioned by Origen and several other historians. I mean, it's a well-known book. However, it's been lost. Or some may say it was destroyed by the church. But what this was, it was a Hebrew gospel, very similar to the Gospel of Matthew. In fact, many people who look into the gospel according to the Hebrews believe it to be the original gospel, and that it was translated into Greek and somewhat changed, and that became what we know as the Gospel of Matthew. So here's an admission that the Ebionites used the gospel according to the Hebrews, which is widely regarded to be the original, very first of the synoptic gospels. And he says, but they use certain other books as well, supposedly the so-called Travels of Peter written by Clement, though they corrupt the contents while leaving a few genuine passages. So here you see that this is the book that we're going to be studying in this series of studies I'm going to try to put together. He's speaking about what has become known as the Nazarene Acts of the Apostles, or the Pseudo-Clementine Recognitions. This is the book that we're going to be reading. But he admits here that this is actually an Ebionite document. And in fact, in the Recognitions of Clement, in the Nazarene Acts, it in itself says that it's written by Clement, and that Clement was sending this information. He was sending his writings to James. So we have within the Nazarene Acts of the Apostles, Clement tells us that he's sending it to James, and then James is associated with the Ebionites, and then 100 years later, a couple of hundred years later, when Epiphanius is writing about this, he mentions that they have this book. So you can see how the whole the series of possession goes from Clement, sent to James, from James to the Ebionites, and now it's being mentioned by Epiphanius. He says, nor are they ashamed to accuse Paul here with certain fabrications of their false apostles, villainy and imposture. They say he was a Tarsian, which he admits himself and does not deny, and they suppose that he was of Greek parentage, taking the occasion for this from the same passage because of his frank statement, I am a man of Tarsus, a citizen in no mean city. They then claim that he was a Greek and a son of a Greek mother and Greek father, and that he went up to Jerusalem and stayed there for a while, desired to marry a daughter of the high priest, and had therefore become a proselyte and been circumcised. But since he still could not marry that sort of girl, he became angry and wrote against circumcision and against the Sabbath and the legislation. So, this in itself is probably, to most of you, a very controversial statement. And this is something that I hope to get into somewhat throughout the study. There are many people out there on YouTube and Facebook that spend a lot of time, bashing Paul and calling him a false apostle. And the majority of what they say is really nothing other than slander. I'm personally not interested in slander. I'm not interested in, just going out vindictively to destroy Paul's reputation. That being said, if Paul is a false apostle, do we not need to know that? And that's the key. Most people don't even want to look at it. They don't want to think about the fact that Paul might be a false apostle. But how would we know? Well, I would say that the best way to know would be to know, what do the original apostles feel about Paul? In the book of Acts, we're given the impression that things were favorable between himself and the other apostles, including James. However, if you look at Paul's epistles, you begin to think that maybe there was a different story there. Personally, after coming to this information about the Ebionites and studying it, and studying a number of different historical documents, what I believe happened was, I believe that initially Paul was part of their movement, that at first, when he first had his conversion, they accepted him. They believed that he was teaching the same doctrine that they were. But over time, I think that either Paul changed his doctrine, or possibly they got to know a little bit more about Paul and realized he was teaching something contrary to what they were. And I'll let you make your decision yourself about that. I do think, though, if there is a possibility that Paul was a false apostle, you owe it to yourself to study that out. Now, Paul is not mentioned in the recognitions of Clement by name. He does appear in there. He's not mentioned by name, but the recognitions of Clement gives you another version of the incident where there was a riot started in the temple, and in the book of Acts it ends with the stoning of Stephen, and immediately afterwards Paul is sent with letters after the assembly to chase them down in Damascus. In the Nazarene Acts of the Apostles, you have the same story, only more detailed, and instead of attacking and stoning Stephen, there is an injury done to James by this unnamed person who's clearly Paul, based upon the comparison between the story in Acts and the story in the Nazarene Acts. It's obviously Paul that attacks James. And immediately after that, this unnamed person is sent with letters to pursue the apostles to Damascus. Again, perfectly fits Paul. So we know that it is Paul. In fact, if you were to go and buy this book, it will probably tell you in the footnotes that the unnamed person is Paul. So Paul appears in the Nazarene Acts, but he's never mentioned by name. But a lot of the doctrines that Peter argues against in the Nazarene Acts of the Apostles are clearly Pauline doctrine. So before you shut this off and say, I'm not going to listen to this because I don't, because I like Paul, again, I ask you to please, think about it and ask yourself, if Paul was false, do I have a duty to study that out for myself? I'm not here to bash Paul. I'm not here to try and, come up with different ways to slander him and different unfounded arguments. However, I really feel like that the the remedy for the argument is not to debate it endlessly, but to honestly go back and study history and to look at what the other apostles said. What literature do we have from there? What references do we have from historians? And then use all the evidence to form your conclusion, not just based upon slander and opinions. And honestly, if you really want to study it out, I think you can come to a pretty good picture of what's going on in the New Testament between Paul and the other apostles. So one final slide before we get into the Nazarene Acts. Epiphanius says that he, being Ebion, this fictional founder of the Ebionites, but he is making a completely false accusation. That accusation is against Paul. This horrid serpent with his poverty of understanding, for Ebion, translated from Hebrew to Greek, means poor. For truly he is poor in understanding, hope, and actuality, since he regards Christ as a mere man, and thus has come to hope with him in the poverty of faith. They themselves, if you please, boastful, claim they are poor, because they sold their possession in the apostles' time and laid them at the apostles' feet, and went over to a life of poverty and renunciation, and thus they say they are called poor by everyone. So, again, you see that that Epiphanius is making sure that he is constantly bashing Ebion and the Ebionites. However, he admits pretty openly here that the Ebionites themselves claim, in his word, that they are poor because they sold their possessions to the original apostles. So again, there's no proof, there's no evidence anywhere aside from what Epiphanius is saying that there was ever this person named Ebion. Ever. But even in the Epistle of James, you see him associating himself with the poor, with the Ebionites. And you hear, Paul is told to make sure he remembers the Ebionites. And so we got these references to the poor in the New Testament. And the Ebionites themselves are telling Epiphanius, he's having some sort of a communication with Ebionites, and they're telling him that no, we were not founded by Ebion, we were founded by the apostles, and that's why we're called Ebionites, not because of Ebion, some guy named Ebion. So that's what we have from Epiphanius. You can also find information on them from Hippolytus and Eusebius and other heresiologists. Just keep in mind, whatever you read about them, you've got, Catholic, Christian, the official church is not going to have anything favorable to say about the Ebionites or the Nazarenes or any of the original followers of Yeshua, because they've got an agenda to protect. Alright, so hidden truth. This is in the Recognitions of Clement. It tells the story of Clement meeting Peter. It contains authentic teachings of Simon Peter. It also contains authentic letters between James, Peter, and Clement. Peter is portrayed as debating Simon Magus, and I'll let you be the judge of this, but I think he was actually debating Paul, because a lot of the doctrines of Simon Magus seem to be very Pauline. It contains lost Ebionite doctrines. Some of these lost doctrines that you hear mentioned by people like Epiphanius, there's a belief called the primal Adam doctrine, which basically is that Yeshua was going to be like a second Adam. And of course you see that mentioned and alluded to in the New Testament a couple of times. And that's what it's meant by, the son of Adam, or the son of man, is that he was a type and shadow of like a repeat of Adam. He was sent to restore what Adam had destroyed. There's also a doctrine known as the standing one, or the standing man doctrine, where Messiah, one of the titles for Messiah is the standing man. And when you see a character, you see this in the New Testament, you even see it back in the Torah, that when someone is said that they stand up or they straighten themselves up, that what they're doing is they're essentially doing some sort of act of righteousness, righteousness or restoration or redemption. And so this is what you would expect from the Messiah. You expect him to be by standing up, he's there to restore righteousness and justice. Now, this Ebionite doctrine, they're all contained within the Nazarene Acts of the Apostles, which is proof that it's a genuine document. It's not something that was written in the 300s or 400s. It's something that, or in the medieval time, like some people say, but it was actually written right after the destruction of Jerusalem. And, some of the storylines likely fictional. I think somebody took the teachings of Peter and took some of took the letters of Clement and put them together and then added a bit of a storyline to it, especially later in the book, as to basically turn it into a novel. But because they did that, they were able to preserve these teachings that we have from Peter. And I really think that if they had not put this into the novel form and had not added the storyline to it to make it sound like some kind of like a romantic novel, then we probably wouldn't have this work today. But because they did that, they were able to preserve and protect the teachings of Peter. Okay, if you want to get a copy of this document, you can go to the web address at the top of your screen, and this page will take you to the home page of the Where to Start area of jacksonsnyder.com. And right there on that screen, there's a PDF that you can click on and get the PDF for free. If you want to order a print copy of it, there is links on jacksonsnyder.com where you can go to his Lulu store and you can order a print on demand version of it. You will have to pay for that. I think it's around $25. This is a book that you want in printed form. Like, this is something you want to be able to highlight and put notes in and flip through and refer back to. This book is going to bless you tremendously if you'll actually take the time to read it. It's got so much information in it. It answers so many questions about what Yeshua taught and what Peter taught and what the apostles believed. I highly, highly, highly recommend getting a print copy of this. But like I said, the PDF version is there for free, so you can get it for free and read it yourself. So, well, that's it. From this point forward, I'm just going to, the next video I put up, I'm just going to start from chapter 1, and we'll make our way through the book, and we'll take it one chapter at a time. A chapter in this book is just a paragraph, so we'll go paragraph after paragraph, and we'll read it and see what sticks out in the reading. And if you get yourself a copy of the PDF, you can read along too. So thank you for listening, and I hope you choose to continue. Shalom.